December. A freezing morning blanketed in fog along the Savannah River. On a man's phone screen, the number blazed in red. $12 million. Gone from the system in just 3 months. And in that moment, his eyes turned cold as ice. This wasn't a bookkeeping error. This was a quiet declaration of war. He didn't tell anyone. No secretary, no board of directors, no advisors. He simply closed his laptop, pulled his coat tighter, and walked out of the 47th floor office, where everyone called him the Prince of Hospitality. His name was Nathaniel Carter, 34, the founder of the Carter House Empire, a luxury hotel and cafe chain stretching across the United States. And now, a small branch in Savannah was threatening to pull the entire empire into the abyss. But they didn't know that the man standing by the river that day, under the modest gray coat, was the very owner they were stealing from. If you believe that sometimes all it takes is one person daring to face the darkness for the whole world to change, then don't go anywhere. This story will make you unable to stop listening. If you're still here, you're already part of this journey. Leave a sign, a like, a comment, a follow, so I know you're ready to stay until the very end, because from this moment on, nothing will be safe. Savannah welcomed Nate with damp, cold fog and the faint scent of roasted coffee carried on the wind. This city had once been his favorite destination, the place where he opened his very first branch when Carter House was still just a tiny riverside cafe. And yet today, this very place was bleeding. He walked slowly down the old cobblestone sidewalk, hood pulled low, blending in with the tourists. No one recognized him as the billionaire Forbes once called, the man who turned coffee into a billion-dollar empire. His destination, a 3-story brick building, Carter House Savannah. Red brick walls, iron balcony railings, golden light spilling warmly from the inside. Beautiful, inviting, but behind that perfect shell was a hole big enough to swallow an entire corporation. The door opened. Wind chimes clinked softly. The cafe was crowded, staff moving quickly, customers chatting and laughing, the smell of baked goods and espresso filling the air. Everything looked too perfect. So perfect, it felt staged. Nate chose a shadowed corner, sat down and began to watch. Every move he made was deliberate, precise, like a hunter who didn't want the herd to sense him. Every register, every glance exchanged between employees, the footsteps that moved just a little too quickly when someone called from the kitchen. No one knew who he was. But he already knew something here was very wrong. A woman's voice called out from behind the counter. Warm, clear, steady but not cold. "Good morning. What can I get you?" He looked up. The woman in front of him was the only one not wearing a forced smile. Her dark eyes held something, strength and fear intertwined. Her name tag read, Imani. "Black coffee, no sugar," he said shortly. "You sure? Everyone here likes a little sugar to make it easier to drink." She gave a soft smile, light but meaningful. "No, I like it real." She paused for half a second, like she understood something. When she brought the coffee over, beneath the white porcelain cup was a small folded note. Nate didn't open it right away. He sipped his coffee, glancing at the mirrored backsplash behind the counter. Imani was acting like nothing had happened, but her hands trembled ever so slightly. When the cafe began to empty, Nate unfolded the note. The handwriting was shaky but clear. "If you want to know why Carter House is bleeding, meet me at the South Dock, 9 p.m. Come alone." In that instant, Nate understood. The game had officially begun. No more sweet, polished reports. No more sterile boardroom meetings. This was going to be a real hunt. Wind from the river slammed against the windows. The lights reflected on the surface of the water like 1,000 thin blades. Somewhere inside this building, someone was hiding a secret big enough to destroy everything he'd built. And tonight, he would face it, not as a billionaire, but as a man standing alone between the darkness and the truth. Because sometimes, to protect the light, you have to be willing to walk straight into the night. Savannah's late afternoon light poured onto the river like streaks of deep golden honey. The breeze from the pier carried the smell of salt and the roasted coffee from the little roadside cafes, a scent that made people feel both warm and quietly excited. The city was beginning to light up. The old streetlights that ran along the riverbanks shimmered and reflected on the water, like a stage set waiting for a big story to begin. Nathaniel Carter, in his simple gray coat, hands in his pockets, walked slowly along the old brick path that ran the length of the pier. Each step he took rang clearly in the night, as if the whole city were holding its breath. He hadn't come to look at the view. He had come because of a small folded slip of paper, hidden beneath the bottom of a morning cup of black coffee. A meeting at 9 p.m. A girl with eyes deep enough to swallow the light in the cafe. A secret threatening an entire empire. Nate had been to hundreds of meetings and signed contracts worth billions, but never before had his heart raced like it did now. Because here, there were no balance sheets to cling to, no lawyers, no chief financial officers. Only him, the dark, and a strange woman. Under the yellow light, Imani Brooks stood waiting. She had her arms crossed over her chest, a thin coat, long curly hair loose and natural, her gaze fixed out over the river. When Nate approached, she didn't smile like she had in the morning. She was silent, as if each minute spent standing there forced her to choose between safety and truth. "You came," she said, her voice low, without a trace of trembling. "Did you write that note for someone else?" Nate asked quietly, his voice lowered as if to make sure no one nearby could hear. "No," Imani answered. "I know who you are, Mr. Carter." A cold wind blew through, sending a lock of her hair across her forehead. In that moment, Nate felt the world blur around them, leaving only those dark eyes, bright, fierce, and dangerous. "You know?" he asked, frowning slightly. "You think a shift manager can't recognize the face that's been in Forbes?" She gave a small, wry lift of her lips. "I was just waiting for the right moment." Nate was silent. Imani was not like the women he'd met in his glittering world. There was something in her that was both sharp and gritty, as if she had learned how to survive in a world that was never fair. She took his hand and led him down a narrow path that ran along the river, out of the light. "We can't talk here. There are eavesdroppers." He let her lead. Their shoes tapped on the old bricks, mingling with the sound of waves and the whine of the wind. They stopped in a shadowed corner where old shipping containers were stacked, blocking the street lamp's glare. Imani turned to face him. "Do you know what Carter House Savannah has been turned into?" "Money being siphoned off," Nate replied tersely. "Not just siphoned," she said, her voice tightening. "Money laundering." All sounds seemed to stop for a second. Money laundering. The word struck the river like a heavy stone, sending out uncontrollable ripples. "Marcus Hale," Imani continued, "regional director. He's not only laundering money, he has people inside the government. Everything here is staged. Reports, the booking system, guest counts, all ghost numbers. They've been lying to you, lying to the whole system you built." "How do you know?" Nate asked, his gaze cold and sharp. "I studied law," she replied. "I noticed the numbers didn't match in March. I watched quietly. I have proof, but if I speak up, Aaliyah will be the first to pay." Her daughter's name slipped out as lightly as a breath but made the air viscous. Only then did Nate realize the tension in her eyes wasn't from fear of being discovered. It was fear of losing something more precious than life itself. Her child. "I don't trust this system anymore," she said, her voice hoarse from holding back. "The local police are on Marcus's side. Some people in the FBI are too. If I hand over the evidence, I'll disappear, like the others before me." A distant light caught on Imani's face, revealing a faint scar along her jaw. Not a large wound, but enough to say she had once known what it meant to be truly threatened. "So," she said, looking up and meeting Nate's eyes, "I can only trust you, or you're one of them." The air stretched taut, like a string ready to snap. Nate didn't answer immediately. In his mind flashed images of thousands of employees across the country, people who had placed their trust in the name Carter House. An empire he had built from his own hands, now hollowed out from within. "Do you have proof?" he asked, his tone steady, though his eyes were no longer icy. Imani pulled a silver USB drive from her coat pocket. The streetlight caught it, making it flash like a small blade. "I copied all the phony transactions, the intermediary transfer accounts, and Marcus's schedule of appearances. But if you take it, you'll be dragged into this. There's no turning back." Nate took it. His hand brushed hers, cold, not from the weather, but because she had lived too long inside fear. "I used to think people like you would never understand people like me," she said quietly. "But if you came here, Maybe neither of us has a way back. The night wind rose stronger, whipping Amani's curls. A ship's horn sounded in the distance. Above them, the lights of Carter House Savannah blazed like a sleeping beast, unaware that a smoldering fire burned at its feet. Nate tightened his grip around the USB. He had come to Savannah to find who had taken his money, but now he understood. This was no longer just about money. It was a war between an empire and those trying to destroy it from within. Amani looked at him, eyes both resolute and fragile. "Do you dare go further, Mr. Carter?" Nate did not answer. He only stared at the lit building in the distance. In that gaze there was no longer curiosity, only resolve. The fire of a man who had chosen to step into the dark, to drag the truth into the light. And Savannah's night grew colder, not because of the wind, but because the real game had just begun. The black coffee was still hot when Nate stepped into Carter House Savannah the next morning. Morning sunlight streamed through the arched glass windows, reflecting off the classic mosaic floor and creating a shimmering light like a stage. The cafe's atmosphere held the warmth of morning and something quietly tense beneath it, as if beneath this perfect surface, a door was closing ajar, leading down into an abyss. Nate sat at the table in the far corner, a spot from which he could watch the entire space without being noticed. He didn't choose this seat out of the habit of a stranger. He chose it for strategy. From here he could see the registers, the entrance, and the discreet exchanges of glances between staff. Since last night, since the meeting with Amani by the pier, everything had changed. He was no longer an anonymous customer. He was a predator stepping into a den of wolves. The door opened. The wind chimes tinkled like they did the first morning he'd come here. Imani appeared behind the counter. Dawn's light washed her face with a soft gold, making her dark eyes reflect something hard to name, simultaneously tender and taut. Unlike the previous morning, she did not wear a service smile today. She was quiet, sharper, as if every step she took had been calculated. "Black coffee, no sugar?" she asked without glancing at the order pad. "You remember well," Nate replied, his voice light as a passing breeze. But inside, every cell of him tightened like a plucked string. She didn't answer, only nodded slightly and turned to make the drink. As she turned away, he noticed her hand tremble. Barely, but for someone who had read body language across hundreds of negotiations like Nate, that detail rang like an alarm. She wasn't afraid of the customers. She was afraid someone else was watching. He scanned the room. 3 people sat at the bar. A tourist couple were taking selfies. 2 delivery staff had just passed through the back door. And at the far end of the counter, Marcus Hale. A perfect gray suit, a black tie, hair slicked back. The man who made everything look more normal than it needed to. He laughed with the staff, but his gaze cut like a knife when it flicked past Imani. His smile never reached his eyes. Imani came out holding a tray, the cup of black coffee placed dead center. Each step she took was a gamble. When she set the cup down, her hand tilted it at a slight angle, as if by accident. But Nate noticed immediately. Between the bottom of the wooden tray and the saucer, there was a small corner of paper peeking out. "Thank you," he said, touching the cup. Their eyes met for half a second, but it was long enough to exchange a whole silent conversation. In that look there was warning, urgency, and an unspoken promise. "This is bigger than us." Imani spun away quickly, not looking back. Marcus didn't stare either, but Nate felt his gaze like a cold blade cutting through the air. It was no accident that the girl chose to pass a message with a scrap of paper in a crowded cafe. This was a place where every word could become evidence. A place where conspiracy was disguised by the aroma of coffee and servers' smiles. He lifted his hand, pretending to sip. Beneath the saucer, the small piece of paper was folded in 2. Imani's handwriting slanted, sharp. "He's watching me. I'll send the file tonight. Don't trust anyone in this cafe." Marcus has eyes everywhere. "Be careful of the female afternoon shift staff. If I disappear, find my daughter first." Reading it, Nate felt his chest drop a beat. 3 short lines that opened into a truly dangerous network. This was no longer a simple money laundering case. This was a game of human control, and the girl was in the eye of the storm. He folded the paper into his palm and squeezed lightly to refold it. His fingers, used to signing multi-million-dollar contracts, now closed around a trembling scrap as if holding a life. A smooth voice sounded right behind him. "Coffee to your liking, buddy?" Nate looked up. Marcus was standing right beside the table. The distance between them was just close enough to hear each other's breathing. He exuded that cold, expensive scent, the kind people like him use to hide the filth beneath. "Not bad," Nate replied. "Savannah mornings are peaceful." Marcus gave a polite smile. "But peace comes at a price, don't you think?" Nate looked straight at him. Not the look of a CEO to a subordinate, but the stare of two predators testing territory. "Someone always pays the price," he said slowly. Marcus tilted his head, the smile thin, but a glint of cold flashed in his eyes. "Hope it's not you who pays." Then he walked away. His steps hit the brick floor like heavy beats. Nate remained seated, the black coffee still steaming, but the air around him had noticeably chilled. He knew, from that instant, that Marcus had smelled the presence of an intruder in the game. A female staffer at the bar shot a quick glance his way. Her smile was gentle, but her eyes were cold. Not the look of an ordinary server, more like someone standing guard. Nate quietly folded the paper into his palm, then slipped it into his inner jacket pocket. Before he rose, he glanced at Imani. She was wiping the counter, her face composed to the point of artifice. But if you were paying attention, you could see her knuckles had turned white from gripping the rag too tightly. In that moment, Nate realized something many years in business had never taught him. An empire can be lost to numbers, but the truth can only be saved by people. This girl had placed her trust in him, a man she didn't really know. And he understood that if he failed, it wouldn't just be the Carter House empire swallowed whole. Her life itself could be erased like a footprint on the sand after a high tide. He left the cafe. Savannah's wind slapped cold against his face. Behind him, the Carter House building gleamed in the morning sun. Grand, splendid, flawless. But now to Nate, it looked like a great beast cloaked in gilded fur, hiding sharp teeth beneath its soft coat. The scrap of paper in his jacket felt like a small ember. And he knew, just one spark in the wrong place could set this whole city on fire. The only question left was, who would fall before the flames rose? The Savannah Pier at night was unlike anywhere else, where warm golden streetlights spilled onto cobblestones soaked in centuries of sea salt, where the sound of waves whispered through the briny wind blowing in from the water. A city like Savannah, so peaceful and old on the surface, always hid something in its shadows. And tonight, Nate Carter felt it more acutely than ever. He walked along the old brick path, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, cap pulled low. His shadow stretched long on the ground, flickering beneath each yellow street lamp. He was no longer just a billionaire inspecting a failing branch. He was stepping into the territory of an enemy whose true face he had yet to see. 8:45 p.m. The harbor was silent. Only the soft lap of waves against the hulls, the clank of a rusted chain scraping wood, and the wind whistling through iron railings. Every step Nate took echoed sharply, as if even the sound might stir the darkness itself. In the distance, a small figure leaned against the railing, staring out at the river. Imani Brooks. She wore a dark brown coat, hood up, black curls falling messily across her forehead. The river wind whipped her coat around her. She didn't turn at the sound of footsteps. Only when Nate came closer did she quietly say, without looking at him, "You're early." "Habit," Nate replied, his voice low, steadying his breath. "Habit of someone who believes in plans. And someone who knows they're being hunted." Imani tilted her head slightly. They didn't need many words. After the note that morning, the trust between them had become a fragile thread, but strong enough to suspend a secret larger than either of them alone. "Marcus has people everywhere," she said, eyes fixed on the dark water. "In the cafe, in places you wouldn't expect. A few people have disappeared just for knowing too much. I won't let that happen to my daughter." Nate didn't ask why she was risking everything. There was something in her eyes that stopped him, a mixture of fear, resolve, and a buried pain that needed no explanation. "Imani," he said her name softly, firmly. She drew a deep breath and turned to face him. Under the golden lamplight, her face came into focus. Beautiful but not fragile, her dark eyes burning with something fierce. She was no longer the smiling server behind a coffee counter. Standing before him now was a woman on the edge, between a dirty world and what was right. "I've been tracking the book since March," she said. "At first it was just booking transactions with no guests showing up. Then came fake kitchen invoices, phantom employee wages, and operating expenses funneling into intermediary accounts. Carter House's system has been turned into a money laundering machine." The river wind grew stronger, carrying the rhythmic slap of waves against the dock like a steady drumbeat. Each word she spoke cut through the fragile illusion of business stability Nate once believed in. "Marcus Hale," she continued, voice low but steady. "He's not the head, but he's the coordinator. He built a network, some local cops are in it, someone in auditing too, and he has a leverage card against me. Aaliyah." The name of the child cut through the air like a blade. Nate felt something tighten in his chest. He had never met her daughter, but the way she said that name told him everything. This wasn't testimony, it was a plea. "They had men hanging around the preschool," she said, lowering her gaze. "Didn't say a word, just stood there. And I knew, the moment I talked to the wrong person, my daughter would vanish like the others." Imani lifted her head, locking eyes with him. Her look was no longer fear, it was decision. "I can't go to the police. I can't trust anyone in the system. I have one shot." "Me?" Nate asked. "You," she said without hesitation. Imani pulled a silver USB drive from her coat pocket. The yellow lamplight glimmered on its cold metal surface. She held it out in front of Nate, her hands steady. The only thing moving was a loose curl whipped by the wind. "I copied everything, the fake transactions, intermediary accounts, nighttime security footage, and warehouse entry logs," she said. "This is enough to take Marcus down, but it's also enough to get me killed." Nate didn't reach for it right away. He looked at her, not like a stranger anymore, but as someone who understood they were now forced onto the same battlefield. "You know this could drag the entire company into the crossfire." "I know," she replied, "and I know you won't let it fall. Carter House is your child. Aaliyah is mine. We both have something we can't lose." For a fleeting second, the wind died down. Only the sound of his heartbeat filled the space between them. Two people, a billionaire and a black woman working the night shift, stood before the same tidal wave. Power, wealth, status. All of it became meaningless when both understood the enemy didn't care about class. Nate reached out his hand. She placed the USB in his palm without a second's doubt. Her hand was cold, but the light grip carried a very real weight. The weight of fragile trust placed on someone almost unknown. "You can walk away now," she said softly. "I won't blame you. This isn't your war." "But it is," Nate whispered. "When someone tears down what I built, I don't stand still." Her eyes trembled. Maybe for the first time in a long time, Imani felt she wasn't alone. From far off, the ship's horn sounded, long and low, like a warning. The pier seemed to shrink into a sealed chamber, a place where choices were made with no way back. Imani stepped back, pulling her hood up. "When you strike back, trust no one inside that restaurant. Marcus has eyes everywhere, maybe even right next to you." She turned and walked away, her slight frame melting into the darkness of the pier. Only the soft echo of footsteps remained, fading with the wind. Nate stood still for a long time. The USB in his hand felt heavy, not because of its metal, but because it held a storm powerful enough to drag Carter House, Marcus, and all the shadows into the light. On the river's surface, the golden lamplight flickered on the ripples, as if whispering, "Nothing stays still forever." From this moment on, Nate Carter was no longer a bystander. He was a man who had stepped onto the battlefield, and the war had officially begun. Savannah's sky was wrapped in a pale gray morning mist, thin like a veil hiding something beneath. The city awoke to the sound of distant ship horns, delivery trucks rolling over old cobblestone streets. But on the second floor of a hotel called Carter House, the light in room 206 had been on for a long time. Nate Carter sat alone at a wooden table near the window, his laptop open before him, the silver USB Imani had given him last night laying beside it. Rows of transactions, suspicious transfers, and strings of anonymous account names scrolled across the screen. Every cold number felt like a needle stabbing straight into the empire he had spent 10 years building. What burned him wasn't the stolen money. It was the betrayal hidden under a flawless surface. Carter House was born from a dream of something warm, transparent, and honest. But the numbers on the screen told a different story. A network of manipulation, rot festering in the heart of his brand. He closed the laptop slowly, leaned back in his chair, and drew a deep breath. Anger wouldn't help him now. What he needed was a plan. A silent, precise plan. Because one wrong move, and Marcus Hale would know Nate was no longer the distant CEO, but a man who had stepped into the game himself. A soft knock on the door. One beat, two beats, gentle, like a prearranged signal. Nate rose and opened it. Imani stood in the hallway, wearing a simple black coat with her hood pulled up, eyes alert like a stray cat used to surviving in dark alleys. She said nothing, just glanced around before slipping inside. The door shut behind them, shutting out the noise of the waking city. "You've seen everything?" she asked quietly. "Enough to know this isn't just about stealing money," Nate replied. "He's built a machine. Every gear fits perfectly. There's no chance of going to the police." "Exactly," Imani said, clasping her hands tightly. "He's got people everywhere." "I tried sending anonymous reports twice. Both disappeared before they reached the bureau." Nate studied her carefully. She wasn't trembling or panicking. She'd lived in this trap too long to believe fear could save her. The way she stood straight, spoke slowly, and held his gaze told him she was ready to go much further than any ordinary employee ever would. "We can't fight him with the law," Nate said quietly. "We fight him on his own turf." Imani frowned. "You mean a strike from the shadows? No warnings, no authorities. We can't knock on the FBI's door, but we can make his system leak itself, and when it blows up, he won't have time to contain it." She was silent for a moment, then slowly sat down across from him. "Talk. You have a plan." Nate reopened his laptop and pointed at the string of anonymous accounts. "Marcus uses a layered network to legitimize fake booking transactions. At least 3 transfer stages. The interesting thing is, he has to manually verify the final transfer to make sure the money lands where it should. Every night he sends a shadow report through the internal system. It only shows up for 3 minutes. Imani shivered slightly. "That's why the traces disappear when I try to access them." "Exactly. But if we plant a script at the exact moment he pulls that report," Nate met her gaze, eyes cold but burning with purpose. "His entire network will unfold in less than 10 seconds. That's when I take everything back." "And if he notices?" she whispered. "Then someone disappears," Nate answered bluntly. "Maybe me. Maybe you." She inhaled deeply, fists tightening. "I've lived in fear long enough. If I don't act, my daughter and I will never have a future." In that moment, inside that small hotel room, 2 people from opposite worlds, a billionaire and a black woman who worked night shifts, stepped onto a path with no return. The plan was drawn out on the table with paper, pencil lines, and an open laptop. Step 1. Nate would pose as a temporary worker under the guise of a drifter looking for part-time work. In disguise, he'd infiltrate the operational system from the inside, tracking the money flow directly. Step 2. Imani would create a safe window during the night shift, when Marcus least expected it, to give Nate access to the internal system and upload the short script. Step 3. When Marcus's shadow report went out, the entire laundering chain would snap back to its origin. If they were lucky, the data would expose the entire network. If not, it would at least throw Marcus into chaos. Imani studied the diagram. A flicker crossed her eyes. Not quite hope, but something close to belief in a real chance. "You've done something like this before?" "No," Nate said plainly. "I built this empire with contracts, not tricks. But," he looked up at her, "when someone tries to burn down my house, I know how to burn it back." The warm light from the window cast half his face in shadow, outlining hard, steel-sharp lines. In his eyes, there was no trace of the confusion he had felt stepping into this conspiracy. Only the cold determination of someone ready to strike first. "There's a problem," Imani said after a few seconds of silence. "One of Marcus's key links is Yvette. She works the afternoon shift. She's also the one who monitors the system. If she spots unusual access, we're finished." Nate nodded. He'd already thought of that. "We'll have to get her away from the console at the exact right time." "How?" with a fake malfunction. A side plan was added. Imani would stage a coffee machine leak on the first floor, pulling Yvette out of the control room for about 3 minutes. Long enough for Nate to install the script. Just long enough for Marcus to believe everything was normal. Time moved quickly as they refined each detail of the plan. Every step carried risk, but beneath the tension, something quiet began to form between them. Not loud romance, not blind trust, but something rare. Two solitary people who, by accident or fate, now stood on the same side of a war. Imani leaned on the table, looking at the finished diagram. How many chances do we get? One, Nate said without hesitation. Only one. She nodded lightly. Her face was tight, but there was no hesitation. Then we make it count. Near noon, Imani left the room to avoid suspicion. Nate stood by the window, looking down at the bustling street below. Savannah was still noisy, bright and peaceful, as if no storm was coiled beneath its surface. He knew this plan wasn't just an attack on Marcus. It was a gamble that would redefine who he was. A wealthy CEO stepping into the lion's den without bodyguards or lawyers, just his own hands. The wind pushed through the curtains, sunlight slashing across his face. In that moment, Nate clenched the USB in his fist. The match had been struck, and there was no putting it out. When the sun set tonight, the shadow game would begin, and once the gears started turning, nothing would stop them. The Savannah afternoon faded into a dull golden light, the kind of light that made the city feel slower, almost melancholic. The river was as still as glass, mirroring the silhouettes of moored ships and the seagulls circling overhead. Inside the lobby of Carter House, everything played out like a carefully staged performance. Staff offering polite smiles, guests checking in with cocktails in hand, the warm aroma of roasted coffee wrapping around the room. No one noticed that this place was quietly becoming the center of a dangerous game. On the second floor, in a rarely visited maintenance room, Nate Carter gently closed the door behind him. He knew his movements weren't just being tracked by cameras, but by watchful eyes hidden behind friendly faces. Nearly 2 days had passed since he and Imani decided to step into the underground war. The plan was set, but one thing still lingered in the back of his mind: who she really was, and why she was willing to risk her life like this. Imani leaned against the wall, arms folded, the dim yellow ceiling light carving out the sharp lines of her cheekbones and the depth in her eyes. When Nate entered, she didn't smile, didn't speak. Only the old ventilation fan clicked softly above them, counting down to something unseen. "We need to talk," Nate said. Slow, steady. "About tonight's plan?" she asked. "No, about you." She froze for a second, not out of surprise, as if she had known this moment would come sooner or later. "You're smarter than any employee I've ever met," Nate continued, his eyes locked on her. "You know how to bypass Carter House's internal security. You know when the money moves and how Marcus manipulates it. No one learns that just by running the night shift. I want the truth." A silence stretched out. Imani clenched a fist at her side, as if trying to keep her voice from trembling. She stepped closer to the work table. The white glow from the monitor lit her face, revealing fragments of old memories she'd buried deep. "I wasn't always a barista," she said quietly. 4 years ago, I was a second-year law student." Nate's brow lifted slightly. "Back then, I believed justice was real. That if I worked hard, I could become a lawyer. That I could give people like me a voice." She let out a soft laugh, one without a trace of joy. "I was naive." The wind slipped through the door crack, stirring the curtain, like a whisper from the past pulling her backward. "His name was Derek, my boyfriend then. We both studied law. One night the police stormed in. They said he'd killed a man near the warehouse district. I didn't believe it, but what I didn't know was that the whole case had been arranged." Imani inhaled, eyes fixed on the gray tile floor. "They found the knife with his fingerprints on it, but it was from my own kitchen. They fabricated witness statements. Derek was sentenced to life. No lawyer dared to touch the case. I learned quickly, justice only exists for those with power." Nate went still. Her voice held no tears, only a weariness polished by years of surviving. "I left school, worked whatever jobs I could to raise Aaliyah. I thought if I kept my head down, we'd survive. But when Marcus started twisting Carter House, I saw Derek's eyes again. In the face of an employee he threatened. The eyes of someone who knows they're about to be crushed by a rotten system. She lifted her head, meeting Nate's gaze. In her eyes, there wasn't just anger. There was a long, hard pain forged into steel. I couldn't save Derek, but I won't let my daughter grow up in a place where evil stands tall over everyone. The dim light framed Imani's face, making her features both strong and fragile. She was no longer the quiet woman behind a coffee counter. Before Nate stood someone who had survived devastation. Nate stepped forward, voice dropping lower. You know, if this plan fails, we won't just lose our jobs. We could disappear. People have disappeared before, she answered, and I've lived my whole life with that fear. But you know what? She tilted her head slightly, her eyes blazing. Fear only has power when you bow to it. The words cut through the thick air like a blade. Nate felt something strange. In all his years at the top, no one had ever spoken to him like this. No begging, no flattery, no posturing, just cold truth, straight to the heart. He looked at her, not as a CEO evaluating an accomplice, but as a man standing in front of a woman with real fire burning inside her. I used to think money and power were what held an empire together, Nate said softly, but maybe it's the truth. And one person brave enough to step out of the dark. Imani didn't answer. She just looked back at him. Their eyes met, not with romance, but with a rare, raw understanding. The kind that only forms between two people who've both been dragged to the bottom, but still found a way to stand. Downstairs, the soft chime of the afternoon bar bell rang out. Outside, Savannah slowly wrapped itself in the gentle darkness of twilight. The city seemed to sink into a slow, calm rhythm. Peaceful, but deceivingly so. Inside this small maintenance room, a secret had been laid bare, and an invisible thread now bound two people together. You asked why I'm risking everything? Imani said quietly as she walked toward the door. Because I already lost everything once. Now I have nothing left to lose. Except Aaliyah. The door closed behind her, leaving Nate alone with the pale yellow light on the wall. He stood still, listening to the sound of her footsteps fading down the hallway. And in that moment, he realized this wasn't just his plan anymore. She wasn't just an ally in the shadows. She had turned this fight from a power game into something meaningful. And for Nate, that made everything more dangerous and impossible to stop. Outside, the Savannah sun dipped below the still river. And in the darkness creeping in, a quiet war was about to begin. There was no turning back now. The night in Savannah descended slowly, like a thick, heavy velvet curtain. The faint yellow lights spilling from Carter House glimmered across the wet cobblestone street, reflecting in shallow puddles left behind by the afternoon rain. The air was dense, damp, and cold. Nate Carter stood on the third-floor balcony, arms folded, eyes sweeping across the empty street. He didn't see anyone, but he could feel someone watching him. It wasn't ordinary fear. It was instinct, the instinct of someone who'd spent a lifetime defending what he'd built from nothing. Since his conversation with Imani about her past, every sense in him had sharpened. He understood clearly. From the moment they stepped into this war, they weren't the only ones making moves anymore. Across the street, in the shadows beneath drooping magnolia branches, a cigarette tip flared red, then vanished. A thin wisp of smoke curled into the night. A tall man in a black coat stood still as stone. His eyes never left Carter House. His face was blank, but his gaze was cold and sharp, like a blade honed to perfection. His name was Victor Hargrove, Marcus Hale's head of regional security. On the surface, he was just a loyal guard. In reality, Victor had quietly stood behind every disappearance of those who knew too much. No one inside Carter House suspected him, but anyone who ever crossed Marcus remembered the name Victor, if they lived long enough to tell the story. He tapped lightly on the earpiece beneath his collar, the praise in the cage. Inside Carter House, the first floor was still full of guests. Soft jazz drifted from the speakers, cups of coffee clinked onto saucers. Laughter mingled with the warm scent of roasted beans. Everything looked calm, too calm. Nate left the balcony, descending the fire escape and slipping into the crowd like just another guest. He had to check the internal system before the plan unfolded. But the moment his feet hit the last step, he froze. A tall black figure stood in the dark corner of the parking lot, where the streetlights didn't reach. The figure didn't move, didn't smoke, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching Nate. Nate's heartbeat quickened. He forced himself to stay calm, took a different path, pretending not to notice. But behind him, footsteps echoed, steady, heavy, deliberate, like a predator who knew its prey wasn't going to run. Behind the bar, Imani was reviewing the work schedule to make sure Yvette wouldn't discover the plan tonight. But when she glanced up at the security feed near the back door, she froze. On the grainy black and white screen, a shadow stood exactly where the camera angle had been shifted the day before. "Victor," she whispered. No one understood Victor's danger better than she did. He wasn't the type to talk. He was Marcus's invisible hand, the one that appeared right when trouble started to grow. Imani moved quickly down the back hallway. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket. A text message from an unlisted number appeared on the screen. "You're playing a dangerous game." She gripped the phone tightly but didn't reply. Her hand trembled slightly, but her eyes were sharp. No longer afraid, just awake. Nate turned the corner, stopping beside a concrete pillar. Victor was still following him. His steps weren't fast, but they sliced through the silence like a whetstone against steel. Nate had no choice. He turned to face him. "Something wrong?" Nate asked, voice low and cold. Victor didn't answer immediately. He took one step forward, light catching half his face. His gray eyes gleamed like glass. "You're new," he said slowly. "A guest with too much free time, who likes balconies, and showing up in places he shouldn't." Nate smirked, half a smile. "You've been watching closely. It's my job. And scaring people? Is that your job too?" Victor didn't smile. His eyes didn't flicker. "I only watch those who don't belong here, and something tells me you're one of them." The silence tightened like a drawn bowstring. Nate's breaths grew heavier. There was nothing hidden in Victor's stare now. Suspicion. He didn't know who Nate was, not yet, but he smelled trouble. Inside, Imani rushed into the small control room, switching the camera back to its original angle. But just one glance at the feed told her Victor hadn't just been standing there. He'd already sensed something was off. She triggered the internal maintenance line. A coded signal she and Nate had agreed on earlier. A short chime buzzed in Nate's earpiece. It wasn't a simple warning. It was the sign. "He knows." Nate brushed a hand against his jacket pocket, the agreed signal back. His eyes never left Victor. "You know," Nate said evenly, each word sharp as a blade. "This place is actually pretty predictable. All it takes is paying attention to who's watching too closely, to figure out who's hiding something." A flicker crossed Victor's eyes. For a brief, razor-thin second, he understood. The man standing before him wasn't just some random guest. "We'll see each other again," Victor said softly, stepping back into the shadows beneath the trees, disappearing as quietly as he had appeared. A few minutes later, Imani came down the hallway, breathing fast. "You okay?" "Yeah," Nate replied, but his voice was colder. "He knows. Victor's Marcus's cleanup man. If he smells trouble, our plan gets torn apart before it even starts. Then," Nate said slowly, "we make him believe he's wrong." The light spilling in from the bars split their faces into light and shadow. In that moment, Nate understood. This wasn't just a game of wits. This was a fight against a creature of the dark, one who could crush their plan with a single, silent move. Later that night, before leaving Carter House, Nate stood looking out at the parking lot. The night wind carried the damp, musty scent of the port. In the distance, a cigarette tip flared briefly, faint and small, then vanished. He didn't need to see the face. He knew it was Victor. Marcus had caught the scent of danger. He was sending a message. "I see you." But Nate lifted his head, staring straight into the black night. His eyes didn't flinch. His message back was just as clear. "You can see me, but I see you too." The fight was no longer a matter of if. It had begun, and the hunter in the shadows had just stepped onto the stage. The night rain fell over Savannah like someone had drawn a thin, cold sheet of water across everything that breathed. The clock on Carter House's wall showed 10:21 p.m., 19 minutes until Marcus's shadow report. In the kitchen, the espresso machine hissed steadily. In the lobby, a jazz band played a soft rendition of Autumn Leaves, just quiet enough to make anyone believe everything was safe. Imani pulled her hood up, slipped through the stainless steel shelving, and stopped in front of the industrial coffee machine. She opened the panel, slid in a thinly cut silicone washer, and twisted the water valve half a turn. A sharp click. In 5 minutes, the first floor would have a minor leak, just enough to pull Yvette away from the control desk. She looked up at the corner kitchen camera. The red light blinked in its usual rhythm. Still good. Downstairs in the basement, Nate stood in the auxiliary IT room, thin gloves on his hands, laptop open and ready. He had waited 3 days for this moment. On the screen, the command window hung like a thin blade. One well-timed enter, and Marcus's entire laundering network would unravel at the seams. His earpiece crackled softly. Imani's whispered, 3 minutes to start. He answered, barely audible. Copy. 10:24 p.m. A single droplet slid from the machine's pipe, trailing down. Imani counted in her head. 3, 2, 1. A hiss burst out, water bubbling gently onto the floor. She shouted, just the right volume. Machine's leaking. Call maintenance. Staff scrambled. Yvette, monitoring from the first floor tech room, rushed out with a toolkit, cursing loudly for show. The door to the tech room swung open. Opportunity. Imani walked past, nudging the door open just a palm's width. She didn't look inside, just paused one breath, then moved on as if she'd never been there. Her voice in the earpiece was a thin threat. Doors open. Nate pulled his hood lower, slipped out of the service stairwell, and crossed the empty hallway. Upstairs was a blur of footsteps, water being mopped, Yvette's annoyed muttering. His hand touched the cold steel door handle of the tech room. It slid open silently. No one inside. The smell of ozone and warm plastic. The servers hummed. The log screen poured data like a waterfall. 10:27 p.m. He plugged in the USB and typed the short command sequence. The cursor blinked, then ran. Data unfurled on the screen like a metallic bloom. Intermediary accounts, layered transfers, temporary authentication strings. Nate's heart pounded like a hammer in his chest. 10 seconds, just 10. In the kitchen, Yvette crouched near the machine, twisting the valve with a hiss. Who the hell fitted this washer wrong? Imani replied softly. Probably the last shift. Yvette's eyes flicked upward, suspicious. Then she straightened. I'm going back. Don't make a mess, she turned away. Imani glanced at the wall clock. 10:28 p.m. A chill ran down her spine. In the tech room, the progress bar climbed to 61%, dipped, then jumped to 74%. The system scanned back through credentials. Nate held his breath. A yellow light blinked on the corner of the screen. Remote ping request. Someone was probing. He slammed out a quick key combo, bounced a ghost IP to a dummy terminal. The yellow light died. 87%. Imani hurried down the back corridor, glancing at the hidden minicam she'd adjusted the day before. Her phone vibrated. Aaliyah. She hesitated for half a heartbeat, then answered. You still awake, baby? A small voice whispered. Mom, there's a man outside the window. He's wearing a hat. He's not knocking. He's just looking. Imani's blood turned to ice. Victor. Lock the door. Pull the curtains. Don't turn on any lights, she said evenly, as if they were just chatting. I'll send Mrs. Ellison over right now. She hung up and fired off a quick text to the neighbor. Go to my apartment now. Don't ask Red. She looked up at the security feed. On the screen, a dark figure slid across the back lot like a streak of ink. 10:29 p.m. Yvette was already heading back toward the tech room. Her heels struck the floor in steady beats. Nate forced the progress bar forward. 96%. A soft beep pierced the air. The outer door opened. No time to hide, except the half-open server rack. He slid into the narrow gap between the rack and the wall, holding his breath. Yvette stormed in, tossed her gloves on the desk, and dropped into the chair. Weird, she muttered, tapping keys. Her eyes scanned the logs. Unusual ping. Her finger hovered over enter. Inside the narrow space, the smell of hot plastic mixed with dust. Sweat stuck Nate's back to his shirt like a sheet of ice. He counted silently. 3, 2. A dialog box popped up, exactly as Nate had scripted. Auto backup scheduled. Yvette exhaled, reassured. Just a backup. She leaned back, grabbed her water bottle. At that moment, the progress bar hit 100%. The USB vibrated faintly like a breath released. Nate slipped it out silently, into his pocket, pressing himself closer against the wall. Yvette stepped near the rack, crouching to check the LAN cables. She was an arm's length away. She squinted. Who messed with this cable? Nate's breath froze. A drop of sweat slid from his temple, clinging to his eyelash. If it fell, it was over. Imani's whisper crackled in his ear. Get out! Now! Yvette's phone rang violently. She snatched it up, annoyed. A voice screamed from the other end. Power's out at the bar! She cursed and sprinted out. The door slammed shut. The room was empty again. Nate slid out of the gap, exhaling like he'd surfaced from underwater. Done, he said flatly. Pulling out. The hallway was chaos. A strip of ceiling lights blinked in an auto-reset loop. Imani's little diversion. Nate moved against the flow of people, head down, hands in his pockets. Just another guest looking for the restroom. Out back, the rain hit his face like needles. The air smelled of salt and metal. He rounded the row of cars and stopped. A cigarette tip flared and died. Victor stood beneath a tree, cap low, rain soaking his shoulders. He didn't move, but his gaze cutting through the rain was fixed on Nate. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was recognition. Nate didn't turn and run. He kept walking, steady. As they passed each other, Victor spoke softly without looking up. Someone touched what they shouldn't tonight. His voice was low, dry, without anger. Just a conclusion. Rain makes a lot of things make noise, Nate replied, strangely calm. Victor paused a moment, measuring. It also shows footprints. They slipped past each other like two undercurrents. No collision, but pulling, twisting. Nate didn't look back. If he did, he'd give something away. His earpiece crackled softly. Imani's whisper, Aaliyah's safe. Neighbors with her. Take service stairwell 2. Nate cut through a narrow passage between mossy brick walls. Rain stung his face. Above him, a window lit up, then went dark. Somewhere in the hotel, the jazz picked up again, like nothing had happened. But the USB in his pocket felt as heavy as stone. Inside it, the arterial map of the beast they were hunting. He met Imang at the service stairwell door. They only looked at each other for a second. No hug, no smile, no congratulations. Just a small nod, between people who knew they'd crossed a line. Marcus will catch the sense soon, Imani said, her voice low and flat. And Victor, he won't wait. Then we stay a step ahead, Nate replied. Outside, the night rain kept beating against the Savannah River, wiping away footprints on the stone. But some marks never wash away. The kind of choices that quietly shift the course of entire lives. Tonight, the trap had sprung. No noise, no blood. Just a door creaked open, and the truth, like cold wind, slid straight into the heart of an empire. The next morning in Savannah had a strange kind of air, so still, so unnaturally quiet that it made people uneasy. The wind rustled through the magnolia trees, leaving behind a faint, crackling whisper like someone murmuring behind closed doors. Inside Carter House, everything moved as it always did. Staff arriving for their shifts, tourists eating breakfast, the espresso machine hissing like there had never been a night of rain, and shadows pressed against the walls. But Nate Carter knew this peace was only surface. Beneath it, the undercurrents were already shifting. On the second floor, he stood by the window, the USB containing Marcus's entire operation tucked inside his jacket pocket, heavy as lead. Everything had gone according to plan. No one had discovered a thing. And yet, the strange feeling in his chest wouldn't fade. A silence that didn't feel natural. A quiet that meant the other side was preparing something. When he stepped down into the lobby, the first thing he saw was Victor. Leaning against the reception desk, hands in his coat pockets, head tilted slightly like an animal scenting its prey. No greeting, no fake smile, but his eyes said clearly, I know. Imani stood behind the bar, face calm as always, but her grip on the milk steamer handle was just a little too tight. Only someone who'd faced danger would recognize the tension behind that composure. Nate gave her a slight nod, a silent signal. Nothing's happened yet. She responded with the briefest glance, cold but weighted. And then the door of Carter House swung open. Marcus Hale walked in. Unlike every other morning, today he wore a black suit with no tie, shirt collar open. His steps were quick and deliberate. Two unfamiliar men followed behind him, dressed like maintenance workers, but with the rigid bearing of men who'd been trained. The atmosphere changed instantly. A warm, easy cafe a second ago suddenly became a sealed room. Imani's grip tightened. Nate felt a chill run down his spine. Marcus stopped in the center of the lobby. He didn't look around. He didn't ask questions. His eyes swept across the staff like a blade gliding across cream, light but sharp. Then he spoke, slow and measured. Something interesting happened last night. Imani felt her heart drop into her stomach. Nate stood at the corner of the lobby, arms folded to hide the tension in his wrists. Marcus lifted the iPad in his hand. On the screen, a system access log from the night before. Location, first floor tech room. Time, 10:27 p.m. A fake ID, but not fake enough for Marcus. Someone touched something they shouldn't have, he said, narrowing his eyes. And I know it wasn't an outsider. All eyes in the room flicked toward each other. The air was so tight, a single sharp breath could have shattered it. Marcus didn't shout. He didn't slam the counter like a man out of control. He smiled. Nate had seen that kind of smile before, on dangerous men across countless high-stakes deals. The smile of a snake that's already seen the trap close around its prey. Marcus snapped his fingers. One of the two men behind him stepped forward, plugged a USB into the large screen by the counter. Access logs lit up like a criminal indictment. But the truly dangerous part wasn't the IP addresses. It was the security footage. Blurry. Rain smeared the lens. But the figure was clear enough. A person in a dark coat, tall, with a firm, recognizable stride. No face, but Marcus turned toward the bar where Imani stood. We have a shift manager who knows the technical system well, and she's also the one who often stays late. Imani felt the blood drain from her face. Nate could see it in Marcus's eyes. This wasn't a guess. This was a trap he had prepared. Do you know the saddest thing about working with people? Marcus took a step toward her. It's not the lies. It's how predictable they are. The cafe fell silent. Imani stood tall, refusing to break eye contact. She knew if she flinched, she'd be signing her own verdict. Marcus didn't need her to answer. He'd already set the stage. Victor stepped forward and handed him a white envelope. Marcus pulled out, not papers, photos. Photos of her leaving the hotel last night in a dark coat, hands in her pockets, the rain glinting under the streetlight, walking quickly. Not evidence in a courtroom, but enough to build a perfect story. Imani Brooks, trusted employee, temporary access to the technical wing, and a past tied to a not-so-clean case. He paused deliberately, like telling an amusing anecdote. I've always wondered why people like you stay inside systems like mine. Nate's pulse slammed in his chest. Marcus wasn't just attacking her with the present. He was dragging out her past, the one she thought she had buried. Imani's hands gripped the counter edge so tightly, her nails bit into her skin. In her mind, Derek's face flashed. The courtroom, the cold fluorescent lights, the neon buzz. But outside, she didn't let a single tremor show. She knew this wasn't an accusation. It was an execution of reputation. Marcus smiled lightly. Funny, isn't it? Someone with a questionable past, caught on camera, on the exact night of an unauthorized access. The perfect scapegoat. Nate didn't move. Every nerve in his body felt stretched to its breaking point. If he spoke now, Marcus would know someone else was involved. If he stayed silent, Imani would be crushed. She lifted her chin. What do you want? Marcus tilted his head. I want the truth. You don't want the truth, she said clearly. You want a story that's easy to swallow. For one short, sharp moment, their eyes locked. What flashed in Marcus's gaze wasn't anger. It was pleasure. The thrill of a predator who'd cornered its prey. This story, Marcus said softly, is already written. Imani was suspended that very morning. Marcus ordered security to escort her out of the staff area as though she were a traitor. Every stare, co-workers, guests, guards, pierced her like needles. No one knew the truth. They only saw a perfect suspect. Nate stood in the corner of the lobby, fists clenched, watching her back as she walked down the hallway. Her posture was still straight, but he knew inside she was screaming. Victor lingered nearby, eyes cold, hands in his pockets, like a man who had just finished a familiar job. He didn't need to say a word. His gaze told Nate everything. This move was deliberate. The back door of Carter House closed behind Imani, swallowing the sound of the rain tapping on the roof. She had nothing in her pocket but her phone. Marcus would make sure she disappeared from the battlefield, if not by his hand, then through gossip, isolation, and fear. But he'd miscalculated one thing. She'd been cornered like this before, and she'd survived. Up on the third floor, Nate watched through the window as she paused under the awning. Small, rain-soaked, but unbowed. The golden streetlight cast a long, unbroken shadow behind her. Marcus thought he'd finished writing the story, but Nate understood. He'd just struck the match that would light a bigger fire. Betrayal isn't always real. Sometimes it's just a shadow written by someone who knows how to tell a story. And even shadows can be torn apart. The night rain had stopped, but Savannah remained shrouded in a heavy gray stillness, as if the whole city was holding its breath. There was no sound of water anymore, only the wind moving through the magnolia trees, rustling like the footsteps of invisible figures. Inside a small apartment south of the docks, a faint nightlight spilled from the crack of a bedroom door. Aaliyah slept on her wooden bed, teddy bear tucked in her arms, her breathing soft and even. Everything looked peaceful, but it was the kind of peace people who have lived in fear never trust. Imani sat on a chair by the window, the glow from the streetlight cutting her face in half. She hadn't slept a single minute since Marcus staged his betrayal act that morning. The memory of her co-workers' stares, seeing her as a liar, still clung to her like cold mud. But what kept her awake wasn't that. It was the quiet, the wrong kind of quiet, the kind that warns you something worse is coming. Her phone buzzed. The screen flashed. Unknown number. Her heart jolted once. She answered with a trembling hand. Miss Brooks, a man's voice, deep, no need for introduction. Victor, no threats, no laughter. Just 3 cold words sliding into her ear like a knife. We found you. Minutes later, the only sound in the apartment was the door being kicked open. 3 figures burst in, fast, precise, silent. Black masks, all in black. She jumped up, yanking the chair toward them, but a quick strike from behind sent it crashing to the floor. Don't scream, a raspy voice ordered. The kid stays safe if you cooperate. Aaliyah woke with a start, eyes wide, blinking at the chaos. Imani shouted, "Don't touch her!" Before she could move, one man grabbed her arm and twisted it sharply. Pain shot up her spine, crushing her breath. Another man lifted Aaliyah out of bed. She cried out once before a soft cloth gag cut her voice short. It was over in under 30 seconds. The door slammed. No wasted noise, just silence, and a single overturned chair on the cold floor. At a riverside hotel, Nate Carter sat before his laptop, reviewing the USB data, transaction chains, account routes, transfer timestamps. It all formed one perfect network. He finally had proof. All that remained was handing it over. But when the screen flashed with a new message, a blade of instinct carved through his chest. No text, just a photo. Aaliyah in the back seat of a van, her head resting on the window, wrists tied with white cloth. A slanted angle, just enough to catch the blurred license plate behind her. Beneath it, we talk. Alone. 11:30 p.m. Dock 12. Dock 12. A derelict pier on Savannah's edge. Nate gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles went white. This wasn't a threat. This was war. Imani woke in darkness. Her wrists were bound behind her back. Duct tape sealed her mouth. The air was thick with the stench of gasoline, damp wood, rusted metal. Low ceiling. Echoes from outside. The slap of water against hulls. Wind slicing through broken boards. She knew this place. The abandoned docks. Victor stood a few meters away, unmasked, his face clear under the pale yellow light. No sneer, no anger, only cold certainty. The look of a man who believed he was just doing his job. You're smart, he said evenly. You made Marcus cautious, but you left traces. She growled into the gag, the sound muffled. He circled her slowly, like a wolf that had grown bored of the chase and was deciding how to kill. You thought numbers could save you, but you don't understand. He stopped inches from her face, breath icy. Marcus doesn't play by the law. He is the law here. 11:27 p.m. Dock 12 hung heavy in fog. Rusted chains swayed like sleeping serpents. Nate emerged from the darkness, gripping the USB in his hand. Wind off the river sliced across his face. Every step carried him deeper into a trap he already understood. A black van idled at the edge of the pier. Two men stepped out, weapons hidden beneath their jackets. The side door slid open. Aaliyah sat huddled in the back seat, gagged, eyes wide with terror. Inside the warehouse, a yellow light glowed. Victor waited, a towering figure between Nate and the girl. "You came," Victor said flatly. "Let her go." Nate's voice was hoarse, taut as wire. "I'm not here to bargain." "Oh, but you know the rules," Victor said with a crooked smile. "One innocent life. For what you're holding." Nate pulled the USB from his jacket, letting it glint under the light. "Everything's here. If you touch that girl, Marcus loses everything." Victor chuckled, low and quiet. "Marcus doesn't care about everything. He cares about power. And power," he leaned forward slightly, "is making men like you believe you have no choice." He motioned to his men. They dragged Aaliyah out of the van and shoved her toward the pier's edge. A rope dangled over the black water below. Wind ripped across the dock, tossing her hair, streaking her tears. "Hand it over," Victor ordered. Imani heard every word. Her heart clenched until it hurt. Aaliyah's muffled sobs sliced through the night, tearing at her like blades. She pulled against the rope until it cut into her wrists. She remembered what it felt like to be helpless, and she swore it wouldn't happen to her daughter. A faint click. The knot loosened. A jagged strip of metal behind the chair, something they'd missed, had become her blade. Outside, Nate threw the USB onto the dock. The sound rang out like steel on steel. Victor nodded for one man to fetch it. And then, a soft crack from the warehouse. Imani burst out of the shadows, wrists bloodied, the rope trailing behind her. She slammed into the man holding Aaliyah. The impact knocked him back, the rope around Aaliyah's wrists loosening. The little girl collapsed onto the pier, choking on her own sobs. "Run!" Imani screamed. Victor spun on instinct, but Nate was already there. A hard strike to Victor's wrist sent the gun clattering across the dock. The river wind howled. Chaos erupted beneath the dull yellow light. One man lunged at Imani. She turned, looped the frayed steel wire around his throat, yanked hard. All the years of being crushed beneath a rotten system poured out in that pull. He dropped to the ground, gasping. Victor was fast, faster than she expected. He and Nate fought near the edge, blows echoing across the river. Victor was stronger, but Nate had fought different kinds of wars. Boardrooms where the wrong move cost lives. This time it was a child's. A clean pivot. Victor stumbled, hit the wooden planks, spine crashing against a rusted piling. Nate lunged, ripped the rope from his hand, pressed it against his throat. "It ends here," Nate hissed. Imani cradled Aaliyah in her arms, hands trembling but eyes burning bright. She held her daughter against her chest, feeling the fragile warmth of the one thing she'd never let anyone take again. Far off, a ship's horn moaned through the night. Savannah was still cold, but on Dock 12, under the flickering yellow light, darkness no longer ruled. Marcus had made the worst mistake of his life. He touched the one thing a mother would burn the world to protect. The morning fog drifted over the Savannah River like a thin sheet of silk, cold, pale, and unsettling. Cargo ships lay silent at the dock, their outlines half drowned in the mist. Yellow light from the pier lamps cast long shadows on the wet ground, creating a scene straight out of a noir film. Still, suffocating, and heavy with the scent of last night's conspiracy. The wind bit like a blade against the skin. But in Nate Carter's eyes, this was no longer the predator's night. This was the stage for a reversal. Victor lay unconscious against a piling, rope marks still etched around his throat. His two men were tied up in a corner, mouths gagged. Near the pier's edge, Imani held Aaliyah close in her arms. Both of them shivered from the cold and from what they had just survived. But there was no fear in Imani's eyes anymore. Only fire, a quiet flame that had waited years for this day. Nate stared out at the water for a long moment, his breath fogging in the air. He knew Marcus wouldn't stay quiet after a hit like this. A beast like him wouldn't run when wounded, it would strike back. The difference was, this time, the beast didn't know it was walking straight into a trap. Imani lifted her head, voice hoarse but steady. We can't keep running. When he realizes Victor failed, he'll send everything he's got to wipe us out. Exactly, Nate replied, his eyes as cold as the river at dawn. That's why we strike first. She looked at him. You have a plan? He nodded. Marcus thinks he's cut off all our exits, but he forgot one thing. His empire is built on fake data, and data can be turned back against him. She frowned slightly, listening. His transaction system has 3 relay layers: ghost accounts, laundering hubs, and legitimization channels. The USB I pulled contains the full network map. If I trigger the original money flow and reverse the ownership, the system will automatically report itself to the federal level. She froze. You mean? Exactly, Nate said, his voice sharp as a blade. I'm going to make Marcus turn himself in. 8 a.m. The Carter House Savannah headquarters opened like any normal day. Employees clocked in. The coffee bar buzzed. No one knew a ticking bomb was buried right under their polished floors. Marcus Hale strode in with his trademark confidence. He'd worn power for so long he didn't even notice the wary glances around him. In his eyes, everyone in this building was a piece on his board. But this morning, the pieces were no longer where he'd left them. From the rooftop of the building opposite, Nate peered through a small lens. He'd already planted a remote trigger in Carter House's internal network the night before. One signal, and every layer of digital armor Marcus built would flip like a card. Imani stood beside him. Aaliyah was somewhere safe. On Nate's laptop screen, Marcus's transaction grid glimmered, rows of account codes, each a knot in his criminal web. And that web was about to become a weapon. Inside, Marcus settled into his leather chair with a cup of coffee, ready for the usual morning meeting. He had no idea every camera in the building had been rerouted, every feed quietly streaming out through a hidden line planted during the rainy night. The moment his fingers touched the keyboard, alerts began flashing across the central screen. Account A12, locked. A13, locked. A17, reverse flow initiated. System errors cascaded across 5 international gateways. What the hell? Marcus snapped. An IT technician ran in, pale-faced. The system is sending automatic reports to federal channels. Cut the line, Marcus shouted. We can't, the tech yelled back. Root access is overridden. Marcus on the rooftop. Nate entered the final command. The USB data ignited. In seconds, Marcus's dirty money flows, hidden for years, were stripped bare. This was the fatal flaw of a man too sure of himself. The tighter you build your fortress, the easier it is to predict where to break it. 9, 8, 7, Imani counted softly under her breath. At 5, automatic report, illegal target activity, signal confirmed. Marcus froze. His hands clenched the table. The IT tech trembled. The boardroom filled with silence and wide eyes. Everything Marcus had buried was now exposed by his own system. Outside, the first police sirens sliced through the fog. Federal agents had been waiting for this signal. Nate had made sure of it. Marcus rushed to the window, horror in his eyes as black vehicles slid to a stop in front of Carter House. Shut it down! Shut it all down! He screamed. Too late. Imani looked down at the scene. Her chest felt heavy, not with triumph, but the weight of years of fear finally breaking loose. Marcus, who had taken so much from so many, was cracking apart before her eyes. How long have you been planning this? She asked quietly. Since the moment he took your daughter, Nate answered, still watching the building. He wanted to use fear. I'll crush him with the one thing he thought untouchable. Inside, Marcus was forced to the ground, wrists locked in steel. Victor, fresh from last night's defeat, was dragged out too, cuffed and silent, like a beast stripped of its fangs. The people who had smirked behind Nate's back said nothing. They understood. The empire had fallen where it was born. Marcus lifted his head toward the glass, eyes searching outside. Across the street, Nate Carter stood tall, saying nothing, smiling at no one. Marcus hissed through clenched teeth. You'll pay for this, Carter. No, Nate said softly into the mic. Today, you pay. An hour later, Carter House was locked down. Federal agents seized every server, Every financial record, every piece of hardware. Marcus Hale was dragged out in cuffs, his face twisted in rage and humiliation. He'd planned to end Nate quietly. Instead, he'd triggered his own sentence. Imani walked out with Aaliyah holding her hand. The same employees who'd once believed Marcus's lies now watched her in silence. Not suspicion, but recognition. The truth had finally forced its way into the light. Nate walked beside them, silent. They weren't heroes, just people who refused to stay pawns. The sky over Savannah was still gray, but morning light broke through the fog, spilling over the old cobblestone streets. Their footsteps echoed like the opening notes of a new chapter. Marcus's empire had fallen, but the story wasn't over. Somewhere in the dark, there were others like him, waiting for the next Marcus to rise. Imani squeezed her daughter's hand. Nate stared at the sealed Carter House sign. They'd won a battle, but the war was only beginning. This time, they weren't pawns anymore. They were the ones moving the pieces. That morning, Savannah woke to a kind of light the city hadn't felt in a very long time. Clear, open, free of the scent of schemes and the quiet fear that used to hide behind every corner. Golden sunlight poured onto the dew-soaked cobblestones like a thin layer of honey. Laughter returned to the little cafe at the end of the street, light as the river breeze. Carter House still stood by the water, but it was no longer the beast lurking in the dark. It now stood exposed under the sun, with nowhere left to hide the fangs that had once made people tremble. Imani stood at the second-floor window, the same spot where she used to lower her head during night shifts, where she'd endured suspicious stares, hushed phone calls, and countless moments when she thought her life would never escape that cage. The sunlight brushed her face, warm and bright. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. Down in the lobby, the employees of Carter House gathered, not in tense silence, fearing Marcus's arrival, but simply to talk like ordinary people. The cautious whispers of the past were replaced by soft sighs of relief. Some glanced at Imani, exchanging quiet nods, unspoken apologies. She didn't blame anyone. She knew what it was to live in fear. It makes people trust the strong, not because they want to, but because they see no other way. Across the street, in a temporary office, Nate Carter sat at a wooden table, sunlight spilling over his gray-brown hair. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, but his eyes were sharp, just as they'd been the day he first arrived in Savannah. On his laptop screen glowed an official federal notice. Marcus Hale indicted on 17 counts, money laundering, witness intimidation, falsifying financial documents, and more. Everything he'd hidden behind the mask of a trustworthy manager was finally stripped away. The door opened. Imani walked in, no longer in her old uniform, just a white shirt and jeans, simple, strong, like someone who had finally stepped out of the dark. Nate looked up and gave her a small smile. Not the smile of a CEO, but of a comrade. Federal confirmation, he said, closing the laptop. Marcus isn't getting out for a long time, and Carter House has been officially severed from everything he built. Imani nodded. Her eyes didn't gleam with triumph. Inside, it felt like an old wound finally closing. Still warm, still tender. People lost too many years living in fear, she said softly. You can't erase that in one morning. Nate leaned back. Light doesn't erase darkness. It just leaves it nowhere to hide. A week later, Carter House reopened. This time there was no Marcus, no fake reports, no shadow networks waiting behind the walls. A new nameplate gleamed above the office door. Imani Brooks, acting CEO. That morning, as she stepped onto the wooden platform in the lobby, dozens of employees stopped their work to look at her. Not because she had power, but because she had earned respect. She had stood up when everyone else kept their heads down. She didn't read the speech someone had prepared for her. She looked everyone in the eye and spoke clearly, softly, but with steel beneath the words. We don't need a leader who makes people afraid. We need a place where no one has to tremble when they walk through the door. I'm not a hero, but I believe we can make this place Carter House again. Not someone else's den. There was no loud applause, only a quiet, meaningful silence, the kind that only exists in real moments. Then someone placed a hand on the counter. Another nodded. A single clap echoed, then another, until the sound grew. A long, rolling wave of applause. For the first time, Carter House had a morning without Marcus's shadow. That night, Imani returned to the small apartment where it had all begun, where she and her daughter had once huddled in fear. The window still faced the docks. The wind off the river still smelled faintly of salt, but now it carried no danger. Aaliyah sat on the carpet, stacking tiny Lego blocks, humming a tune. She no longer flinched at a knock on the door, no longer pulled the curtains at the sight of a figure outside. Imani sat beside her, wrapped her arms around the little girl, and whispered, "It's different now, Aaliyah." The lights back. Meanwhile, Nate Carter stood on the rooftop across from Carter House. Sunset turned the river gold, light reflecting on his face. He just won the greatest battle of his life, not through power, but by stepping out of it and fighting the system head-on. His phone buzzed. A message from the corporate board. Board approves restructuring. Carter House Savannah will remain operational but independent. We want Miss Brooks as branch CEO. Nate smiled faintly. He could have stepped back into power instantly if he'd wanted to, but he knew it was time for someone else to lead, someone with real fire. The next day, he met Imani by the river where they'd first crossed paths. There was no darkness now, no secret USB, no cold wind, just a calm morning and sunlight dancing on the water. "You changed this city," Nate said quietly. She shook her head with a soft smile. "No, we did." There was no embrace, no cinematic ending, just two people standing side by side, looking toward Carter House. No longer a symbol of fear, but a living proof that darkness may be strong, but light always returns. That night, as the city lights shimmered on the river, Savannah no longer belonged to those who walked in silence and fear. It was once again a city of laughter, of real mornings with real sunlight. And in that light stood the silhouette of a black woman who had once been just a night shift manager, now standing on the leadership platform, her eyes shining like the sun. Nate walked off into the night, carrying no titles, no trophies, just one truth. Sometimes the hero isn't the strongest one. It's the one who stands up first. Light doesn't erase darkness. It forces it to step back. And that night, Savannah's darkness finally did. Savannah's night was bright again, as if the darkness had never existed. Strings of golden lights lined the riverfront, reflecting across the shimmering water. The old cobblestone streets were alive with laughter. Carter House, once a den of schemes, now stood at the heart of the city, glowing brilliantly against the night like a declaration. The darkness had retreated. The night wind carried the scent of salt water from the harbor, mingled with the warm aroma of coffee from the small cafe nearby. On Carter House's rooftop, Imani leaned against the railing, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot cocoa. She no longer wore her night shift uniform. She no longer lowered her head in silence. Her curls fell freely, her face was calm, but in her eyes was something deeper than joy. A quiet awareness of everything she had endured to stand here. Below, the city buzzed with life as though it had never trembled. But only those who had lived in the shadows understood. This light had been paid for, with blood, with tears, with endless nights when escape seemed impossible. The rooftop door opened. Nate Carter stepped out, his long coat swaying lightly in the breeze, hands in his pockets, hair tousled by the wind. He was no longer the cold CEO who had arrived in this city as its owner. He was a part of it now, a part of its war. "You still love the view from up here," he said softly. Imani smiled faintly and took a sip of her cocoa. "Back then, I stood here every night, wondering when my life would change, when I'd stop staring at the river, afraid of who might be watching. And now?" "Now," she said, eyes lifting to the dark water. "I stand here to remind myself that light never comes for free." In that moment, the night breeze seemed to slow. Everything they had lived through, the chases in the dark, secret files, the night of the kidnapping, the blood, the tears, the final turn of the game, folded into a single, quiet second. Heavy, deep, unforgettable. Nate stepped closer, not too close, but enough for the city's golden light to cast across both their faces. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, polished key. "This," he said, "is the key to Carter House's executive office. I turned down the position. The board agreed to let you have it." Imani looked at him, surprised. "I thought you were going back to New York." "I am," he nodded, but not to disappear. I'll handle the financial structure remotely. This place needs someone who belongs to it, not a man who flies in on a private jet and leaves." She fell silent. Something rose quietly in her chest, something unspoken, somewhere between pride and ache. "Why me?" she asked softly, almost afraid the wind might carry the words away. "Because you fought for this place, before it ever belonged to you," Nate answered. "I built Carter House, but you're the one who saved it." They stood together, saying nothing more. The river lapped gently against the docks below, marking the passing of time. Down on the street, Aaliyah played with neighborhood kids. Their laughter carried on the wind, an ordinary sound. But to Imani, it was the greatest gift life could return. "You know," Nate said quietly, still looking out at the city, "when I first came to Savannah, I just wanted to fix a financial mess. I didn't expect to fight a war. But you turned this place from a problem into a story worth living." Imani laughed softly. "And you weren't exactly the cold, untouchable boss I thought you were. Maybe because you reminded me of who I was before all the contracts, the numbers, and the power games," he said, voice low, warm against the wind. "You fought like someone with nothing to lose. And for the first time, I fought for something that mattered." The wind from the river swept through, tossing Imani's curls. She turned, leaning her back against the railing, looking at Nate, not as a CEO, but as the man who had stood beside her through hell. The golden light wrapped softly around their faces, everything still, almost weightless. "Will you come back?" she asked. Nate looked at the city, then back at her. "Savannah has become a part of me. No matter where I go, I'll return. Some places you visit, some hold on to you." A quiet moment passed between them, not awkward, but full. Between them was something beyond words. Imani slowly held out her hand, not a formal handshake, just a simple gesture. Nate looked at that hand, the hand of a woman who had stood against an entire system, and took it. His hand was warm, hers small but steady. Their shadows stretched across the rooftop, merging into one. "We have a promise, Nate Carter," she said softly but firmly. "If Savannah ever falls into darkness again, we'll drag it back into the light, no matter what it takes." "A promise under the lights," Nate replied. Below, the city clock struck 9 p.m. The golden lights shimmered on the river like stars scattered across black silk. Carter House stood not as a symbol of power corrupted, but as a living proof. Light never truly dies. It only waits for the brave to reignite it. On the rooftop, neither of them said another word. They didn't need to. This was more than an ending. It was the beginning of a promise. A promise unwritten, unsigned, unsealed, but stronger than any contract. Born from people who had lived in the dark. The golden light wrapped around them in a soft halo. The night winds slipped gently past. And in the heart of Savannah, a promise was born. Dawn stretched over Savannah like a sheet of gold laid across the river. The morning mist hadn't fully lifted yet. A thin veil of vapor hovered above the old cobblestone streets, wrapping the entire city in a soft, lingering painting, gentle yet deep. Carter House, once a symbol of darkness, now welcomed the first light of a new day through wide-open windows, no longer locked tight like before. Imani stood in the main lobby, the very spot where she used to bow her head to greet guests every night. But now, she was no longer the quiet night shift manager. A new nameplate gleamed proudly on her chest. Imani Brooks, CEO, Carter House, Savannah. Inside there was no showy pride, just a quiet, unwavering peace. The kind that only comes when someone reclaims what was once taken from them. Employees bustled about, preparing for the official reopening after the full restructuring. No one barked orders with threats. No one tiptoed around to avoid their superior's gaze the way they used to when Marcus was here. A new atmosphere threaded through every corner of the building, light but strong. It felt like the first real breath after years of being suffocated. Imani walked slowly down the dark wooden hallway, her fingers brushing the walls where old picture frames once hid Marcus's surveillance cameras. Now, those cameras were gone, replaced by black and white photographs of the city and of the people who had worked here for years. Each step on the wooden floor echoed like another step out of the past. She stopped at a large glass door facing the riverfront. It was at this dock that she had once stood trembling, clutching the first note from Nate, whispering truths no one dared to hear. Now sunlight spilled across the water, and those memories melted into the early morning light. A familiar voice spoke from behind her. "I'm guessing you still love this view." Nate Carter stepped into the lobby, hands in his pockets, a faint smile on his face. He'd flown back to Savannah at dawn, not as a high-ranking CEO this time, but as a friend returning to the place where they'd fought side by side. "This view used to terrify me," Imani said softly, eyes still on the river. "But now, it only reminds me that everything can change." They walked out together to the front terrace. Savannah at this hour was lively but not loud. The rhythm of footsteps, the wind, and the gentle slap of water against the dock blended into a kind of quiet symphony. In front of Carter House, the magnolia trees bloomed pure white. Sunlight filtered through each petal and fell onto the steps, making the whole place feel almost sacred. "You turned this place into something I never imagined," Nate said. "A Carter House that doesn't live on dry reports and power plays, but on people's breath." Imani laughed softly. "The truth is, these people are Carter House. I only gave them back what was already theirs." Inside, staff were hanging white ribbons along the bar and taping up small, handwritten slogans. Not corporate mantras, but words they wrote for each other after everything they'd survived. "No one has to bow to fear anymore. Together, we'll keep this place lit." Each sentence was a quiet vow, handwritten, not printed. And that alone made Carter House different. Imani turned to Nate. "You know, I used to think rebirth came only from the strongest, but it really starts with the weakest, when they decide they won't stay weak anymore." Nate looked at her and nodded. "That's the real strength." By midday, sunlight poured into Carter House, spreading across the wooden floor like honey. The main doors stood wide open. No security fences, no guards. Instead, guests were greeted with real handshakes and genuine smiles. Aaliyah ran through the hallway waving a little handmade flag that read in messy letters, "The house is back." Her laugh rang like a glass bell, and the staff around her smiled. No one needed to explain what it meant. One child's joy was enough proof of real change. That afternoon, Nate and Imani sat together on the rooftop, the same place where they had once made their promise under the lights. The city below glowed gently, alive but peaceful. No sirens, no shadows slipping through the night. "Do you remember how it felt the first time we stood here?" Nate asked. "Of course," Imani smiled. "Back then, I thought I'd never have a future. And now?" "Now," she lifted her gaze to the golden sunset spreading over the river. "I know the future isn't something people give you. It's something you choose." A silence fell. Not the heavy silence of nights spent facing Marcus, but the calm kind that comes from people who have already weathered the storm together. Nate turned to her. "What's next for you?" Imani closed her eyes briefly, inhaling deeply. "I want to start a program for people who've lived trapped in fear. Women, workers, those without a voice. I want Carter House to be a beginning, not an ending." Nate's eyes glimmered with genuine respect. "A new beginning." "Exactly," she replied, her voice steady as steel but soft as Savannah's evening wind. The sunset bled across the city, streaking the water with shades of red and gold. Jazz music floated out from a cafe down the street, mingling with the breeze. The rooftop of Carter House was bathed in this light, the light of a beginning. Imani rose, bracing her hands against the railing, staring toward the horizon. Nate stood beside her, silent. Between them, no more grand promises were needed. They'd already made their vow under the nightlights. Now, they simply had a future. "You know what's strange?" Imani said quietly. "Marcus thought he controlled everything. But men like him only ever build fortresses out of sand. And we," Nate finished, "build foundations out of people." She smiled, a real smile, no longer weighed down by shadows. "And people don't crumble so easily." Below them, the city lights flickered on, one by one, like a string of small flames. Savannah was no longer a city that trembled in fear. It had become a city of people who dared to stand up. And at its heart, Carter House, once a nest of darkness, now stood as a new symbol, the beginning of light. Imani inhaled deeply, feeling the wind brush against her cheeks. Inside her chest, there were no more sharp stabs of painful memory, only a steady flame, unshakable and alive. The start of a new chapter, not with gunfire, not with midnight chases, but with quiet footsteps, from people who no longer feared. Savannah's night closed with a strange kind of light, Not blinding, not fierce, but soft, like a warm breath brushing gently over the water. The river kept flowing, slow and steady, carrying the salty humidity, as if it had witnessed everything and chosen silence. The night wind slipped through the cracks of the old bricks along the harbor, carrying whispers from years gone by. Carter House stood there, not as a fortress of darkness anymore, but as a lantern. Golden light spilled from its windows onto the river, scattering across the ripples like quiet words from time itself. I have seen fear, but now I see hope. Imani stood alone at the pier, the place where everything began, the place where she had once passed a trembling note inside a coffee cup, where every footstep behind her used to feel like the signal of an ending. But now, the wind from the river wasn't icy anymore. It was warm, wrapping around her like a silent thank you from the city itself. Her curls danced in the breeze, her thin coat fluttered. She lifted her eyes toward Carter House, glowing in the distance. Every light in that building was a memory. The night of the kidnapping, the battle of wits with Victor, the final move against Marcus, the suspicious glances, the fears once buried deep. All of it was behind her now, not erased, but solidified, becoming the foundation beneath this very night. "We did it," she whispered. There was no one beside her, but the river heard. Nate Carter approached quietly from behind. He wasn't wearing a suit anymore. There was no trace of the distant, polished executive. A dark jacket and dirt-dusted shoes made him blend into the night as if he belonged to the city itself. He stopped beside her, silent, his gaze following hers, to the building that had become theirs. "You leaving?" Nate asked softly. "No," she shook her head with a small smile. "I'm staying. This is my home." A simple sentence, but for her, a woman who had once been a shadow in the very place she worked, it was the greatest victory of her life. "And you?" she asked. "I'll go back to New York," he replied. "But now I know, I'll always have a place to return to." Imani turned to him, the golden lights reflected in her eyes like water. They both understood without speaking. This wasn't the end of a love story. It was a period at the end of a chapter, and a comma for the next. The night wind whispered through the magnolia trees, rustling like an old familiar song. The river murmured too, its language unspoken, but felt by anyone who stood beside it long enough. It had seen them tremble. It had seen them fight. It had seen them rise from their lowest point. Carter House in the distance looked like a small lighthouse. Not grand, not towering, but bright enough to guide those who'd been lost in the dark. Nate extended his hand. Imani hesitated for half a heartbeat, then placed hers in his. Not to hold on, but to affirm that they had made it through together. And from now on, each would walk forward with their own strength. "Thank you," he whispered. "No," she said. "We did this together." For a brief moment, the river wind swept through, and the light from Carter House shimmered across the water. Their shadows stretched along the pier, melting into the soft ripples like they were being carried away by the river's quiet song. From somewhere down the river, a jazz tune drifted from a cafe, the same song Imani had listened to on nights she thought tomorrow would never come. But tonight, the melody wasn't a voice from the darkness anymore. It was a hymn of peace. Savannah had changed, not because of a miracle, but because of small people who refused to fall, because of promises that needed no signatures, because of a flickering flame kept alive through the longest nights. If you ever think you're too small to change anything, remember this. A single note hidden at the bottom of a coffee cup can spark a revolution. A woman once silenced can become the lantern for an entire city. Light never truly dies. It just waits for someone brave enough to ignite it. And when that light rises, the whole city whispers with it. The Savannah River kept flowing, carrying the wind, the light, and the whispers of those who once stood in the dark. The pier was no longer the birthplace of fear. It had become the origin of something far more beautiful. Hope. The lights reflected on the water, as if they were speaking. If you have a spark, light it. The world is waiting for your flame.